What's up, weebs, and welcome back to Anime Lane, the podcast where we take you down the yellow brick road of anime and have a look at everything it has to offer. As always, I'm your host, Notorious, and today I'm going to be doing something a little bit different. On the show so far, we've always covered anime, but the world of anime is actually bigger than just that on its own. It's come up in episodes before, stuff's based on manga. I talked heavily about the manga in the Akira episode, which I don't actually know if it's out by the time this is coming out. I think this is coming out. I think Akira's coming out after this. I also brought it up with Galaxy Express when I was talking about Leiji Matsumoto. The world of anime also consists of manga, light novels, visual novels, JRPGs, because anime tends to be based on a lot of this stuff. A lot of anime is also original content. That's, stuff like Psycho Pass and Pat Labor, Spirited Away. I think Spirited Away is original. I was going to say most Ghibli stuff's original, but then I remember a lot of stuff by Miyazaki is actually based on books, not typically Japanese books like light novels and stuff. Actual book, Howl's Moving Castle is based on a book by an English author. I think, is it English or Welsh? Something like that. I own the book and I haven't read it yet. I know it's vastly different because, anyway, I'm getting sidetracked. So today I'm going to talk about a couple of light novels. I've toyed with this idea before and I have mentioned it previously, mainly in reference to the series 86, because I really want to talk about that series. It's one of my favourite novels, but I think if I'm going to cover that, since where it currently stands, it looks like we're heading towards the end, and while that may take another maybe two or 3 years, I think I'll cover it more in a sort of when I reread it when it finishes, because I caught up and then started reading them as they've come out, and I think there's one out this month actually. I think it's soon. Is it the end of this month? Something like that. There's a new one soon, and we're kind of heading towards the end goal, so I think I'll talk about that more later. I don't want to do a big episode where I talk about every volume that's out and then another episode where I talk about the new volumes. I want to do it in a bit more of a cleaner sense, maybe just a full episode dedicated to it or something like that. But anyway, yes, today I'm going to be talking about the books, the light novels, Your Forma by Mahiro Kikuishi, I hope I'm pronouncing that right, illustrated by Subata Nozaki and translated by Roman Lemper, and Berserk of Gluttony, written by Ishiki Ichika, illustrated by Fame and translated by Heng T. Lim. So when I cover light novels, I will mention the translator, because this is a big thing within light novels, is the translator's only ever really mentioned most of the time in the sort of beginning pages of the book. Apple on their iBooks platform, which is where I read a lot of my stuff, is starting to list the translators alongside the authors and illustrators on their author byline parts, which is really good. Giving credit to the people that brought us to this in English, because it's a weird thing where it's originally written by Mariho Kikuishi and Ishika Ichika for these books, but we're kind of reading the work of Roman Lemper and Heng T. Lim here, where they've brought it and made it fluid and understandable and engaging in the English language. So it's a credit to both of these people, and of course Subata Nozaki and Fame. They did wonderful illustrations for these books, cover art and then insert pages and certain chapters and stuff like that. So I don't think this is going to be a long episode. I think this is going to be much shorter than most, because I don't really want to spoil these books. I want to kind of cover these in a way that I hope that you'll maybe be interested in reading these, to the point that I don't know if in the future these will get a specific episode covering the new volumes. When it comes to Your Forma, I should clarify, I'm only covering volume 1 and 2 because that's all that's out in English. Volume 3 is up for pre-order and comes out in January. And for Berserk of Gluttony, I'm only covering the first volume, even though I think 8 are out. Yeah, no, 7, sorry. There's 7 volumes out. But I've only read the first one. So I think I'll start with Your Forma. This is very much the one that's up my alley, to the point that I believe it was Roman Lemper talking about it on Twitter, because I follow him, and I think he was tweeting about it around, I guess, at the time he was translating it, but it was before it was like announced for an English release, and they said, you know, it was very good, and I looked it up a little bit, and I found the concept very interesting, because it kind of hits the things I like in sci-fi. So I'll read the synopsis for the first volume here to give you an idea of what it is. So this is the Yen Press synopsis. In an alternate... Oh, fuck it, I'll do that again, sorry. I stumbled over the first sentence. I still need to get used to doing this stuff. In an alternate 2023, the Your Forma, a miraculous smart thread... Oh, fuck. I'll try that one more time. I thought there was a punctuation there when there wasn't. In an alternate 2023, the Your Forma, a miraculous smart thread technology initially developed to treat a massive outbreak of viral encephalitis, has become an integral part of daily life. But these convenient devices come with an invasive drawback. They record every sight, sound, and even emotion their users experience. For electronic investigator Ichika Hiida, diving into people's memories via the Your Forma and hunting for evidence to solve the toughest crimes is all part of the day's work. The problem is, she's so good at what she does that her assistants literally fry their brains trying to keep up with her. After putting one too many aides in the hospital, the top brass finally furnish Ichika with a partner on her level, a brilliant yet cheeky android named Harold Lecraft. Lecraft? I'm actually not sure how to pronounce Harold's last name. Does this unlikely duo have what it takes to resolve their mutual suspicions and avert a deadly technology infection from sweeping across the globe before it's too late? That probably makes it seem like my reading comprehension is very bad. I maybe should have read it a couple of times before recording, to get, you know, good at reading it out loud. So yeah, that's, you know, the base concept of Your Forma is it's set actually just not very far ahead of where we are right now. It's barely futuristic, but in the 90s. So to cover the description a little more in depth and the whole viral encephalitis thing, which is interesting because I'm not sure when the series originally started. I know that the first book came out, I think, last year in English. No, this year even, June, damn. I actually read it when it came out. So it started in 2021. So I guess it is drawing off of the whole pandemic thing, which is interesting because you start reading it and there is a little sort of, I don't know how to put it. It's there's a certain there's something unnerving, maybe unsettling, reading it for the first time, where you're being introduced to, you know, in the 90s there was this pandemic that led to the development of your Forma that basically saved, you know, everyone's life, but also changed the trajectory of, you know, humanity's technological development and all that sort of stuff. It feels very, you know, real because of that, because we were, you know, just, I mean, when I read this back in June, we were sort of just coming out of the sort of late stages of the pandemic, and it's not over now as I'm recording this in November. You know, we're still very much dealing with it, so it made that aspect of it very almost unnerving, and it added a lot of weight to the world of the book because you can sort of relate to the history of that world, you know. And while it is, you know, very different because this is taking place like 30 years after all that happened, and it's, you know, people have adjusted to living with this. The very base of the book, because of the pandemic thing, it's lent a nice amount of weight because of that. I had a few things reading it that I had concerns about, though. In the first book, we're introduced to everything, and one of the kind of core concepts is that when there's certain areas in the world that, for one reason or another, usually cultural reasons, they don't assimilate the Forma technology, or in fact they are total technological dead zones. And at first I was a little concerned about how this was going to be handled in the book, because in the first volume I think it's Native American related, and the reason I was concerned about it is because they refer to these to the people who live in these zones and don't assimilate with the technology and reject sort of the Forma and everything like that. They refer to them as Luddites. And my concern with that was that it would only refer to, people like... sorry, I'm going to try to talk while I look up the mention of the word Luddites in the book so I can get an example here. Oh, here it is, actually. There's a very good one right off the bat here. Mentioned in the first chapter of the first volume here. I'm actually not sure who's speaking at this point. I genuinely have no idea who's saying this line, but it is like a sentence being said to, I assume, Echka. That area is a technologically restricted zone populated by Luddites who object to the use of machinery. And then it specifically refers in the next sentence, and the Sami also make a living off of reindeer husbandry, but some of them work as back alley doctors behind the scene. So it's sort of... So it's, I believe it's Native American, or it mentions Sami here. So I can't... I'm sort of working off of a little bit of memory recall here from when I first read the first volume. Interestingly, there's not, unless it's because I've put it in case, like with an uppercased L. There's only 3 mentions of the word in the first book, which is interesting. I feel like it came up a lot more than that. Yeah, that's... Yeah, sorry, I'm going silent here because I'm kind of trying to skim. Oh yeah, there's a part where Harold kind of feigns like being a human instead of an amicus, which is a sort of a robot android cyborg. Cyborgs are people who've had mechanical upgrades. Amicus are androids, and they sort of work alongside humans in various capacities. Some places have sort of like fully accepted them, like they were created in England in the lore of the books, and this is sort of dealt with in the second book, where their human rights have already been ratified within like English law. Whereas most of the world, it's kind of, they don't have many rights, if I remember correctly. Interestingly, there's a slight hypocrisy there in the second book where they say they have human rights, but they're constantly talking about shutting down Harold because they think he committed a crime. That's just the kind of general premise of the second book, by the way. I mentioned I don't want to spoil anything, and so I won't go any further than that. But it's very interesting, learning about the world within the book and being introduced to these concepts. And I think it does like a fairly interesting job of telling a sci-fi, a very kind of crime... what's the word I'm looking for? Not procedural drama. It's not like, Law and Order or something, but very much like a detective story with a heavy sci-fi backdrop, and Echka in the first book doesn't really like amicus. Amici? What's the plural of amicus? I don't remember it coming up in the book. And she, you know, she doesn't like them, and so when she's paired up with Harold, she's kind of against it, and that's sort of like the kind of one of the most interesting parts of the first book is and even the second one actually is sort of their relationship and how they have to get along and how their relationship develops then in the second book when the first book sort of resolves some issues for Echka. But yeah, it's an interesting sci-fi crime detective. Sorry, I'm failing at describing this book. It's an interesting detective story set in a sci-fi world. It has some very interesting sort of, you know, philosophical implications that it kind of touches on. It'll be interesting to see if those kind of get dealt with a little deeper in future books. But it's one that I kind of, you know, don't want running into the standard light novel problem, which is sort of like Sword Art Online, sort of like That Time I Got Reincarnated as a Slime, a bunch of other light novels that I can't think of off the top of my head, run for just so many volumes. I think at the moment there's 4 out in Japan, or 5. I think one's due out soon in Japan. So I think it's either 4th or the 5th one's just dropped. And it's I don't want it to overstay its welcome. I think this could be a very good, like, short, concise series. I don't think it needs to be like Vampire Hunter D, which has almost like 30 books out in English. It's a little different in Japan. I think there's like some in the English release that have been like condensed into one book or split into 2. So it could be longer, it could be shorter in Japanese. I'm not 100% sure. I think maybe at most 7-8 volumes. I could see maybe just at hitting double digits, 10. But I think if it goes much further ahead than that, it would be too much. I'm not sure, exactly where it would go and how it would end. That's the big thing I see right now. It sort of is set up with an endless loop clause, I guess you could call it, where as long as Ichika and Harold are partners, they kind of can solve as many crimes as they want. They do sort of have an end goal, at least for Harold, because Ichika's end goal is sort of dealt with by the end of the first book. But I hope they deal with Harold's goal sooner rather than later. Like, within a couple of books at least. I don't know sort of where it's going from there. I do think the third book will be interesting, but I could see it very easily sort of losing steam or becoming uninteresting if it doesn't, deal with certain things properly, and if it tries to, they try to, obviously people want to make money off of these things if publishers want more content out of it and kind of that sort of thing. It is very interesting. It's got interesting and engaging characters. I think structurally I do have issues with it, mainly in that it falls just from the first book straight into light novelitis, I'm going to start calling it, where it just has unwieldy massive chapters, because for some reason this is a very common thing in light novels. Interestingly, Berserk of Gluttony doesn't actually do this, but 86 and at points Sword Art Online did it, but at least a lot of the light novels I've read have strayed into the territory of having like 4 or 5 chapters that are just massive. And your Forma does sort of try and combat it by having the chapter then subdivided, but to me if you're doing something like that, just divide it into those chapters and have more chapters. And I think it would make the use of illustrations much better as well, because as it stands, there's not a lot of illustrations in your Forma, and there's not a lot of illustrations in a lot of light novels. Certainly Berserk of Gluttony didn't have too many of them, but I think I feel a little underwhelmed by the use of illustrations in your Forma. There's some really nice ones, there's some really great use of them in the first book, but a lot of the time it's relegated to chapter covers. Because the chapters are so large, they put illustrations as the covers for those chapters, and then we get into, you know, the subdivision of the chapters. And it would be nicer to see those, you know, 4 or 5 illustrations not being used for covers, but just being used at different points within the story. Not necessarily those illustrations, but, you know, the time that the artist spent to create those, being spent to create illustrations that go with somewhere within the story to emphasize something. If we had more chapters, and then, you know, maybe a few more illustrations interspersed rather than having chapter cover illustrations. I hope I'm getting that point across. I feel like I'm not conveying what I'm sort of trying to get at with that. So yeah, that's your Forma. It's a hard one to talk about without spoiling it. Because I can't say too much about Ichika's dislike for Amicus and how because that's not her only issue within the first book. You know, she's a very distant person. She doesn't really like to get along. She doesn't like people very much, and she's very much built up a wall around herself. And while that's sort of, you know, that's still being dealt with in the second book, a lot of problems for Ichika are resolved at the end of the first book. So it's very hard to talk about the first or second book in any sort of detail without instantly spoiling something, especially the second book, because it does really deal with all the ramifications of what happens throughout the first book, and its story. Like I said, Harold is accused for murder, and it's sort of, you know, the whole impetus and thrust of that part of the story is very much driven by what happens at the end of the first volume. So I can't really talk about it in detail without spoiling it, because I don't want to spoil it, because I really want to encourage you to read it. I really like this series. I think it has a lot of potential. I just hope it doesn't overstay its welcome. I think it's really well written, and it's very engaging. The characters are interesting to read. Within the first and second book, you know, the first book has its own cast of characters, and then the second book really just follows Ichika and Harold, and it's there's a lot of new characters throughout the second book that are all equally as interesting. I'd be interested to see if the professor that created the line of Amicus that Harold is from, Professor, she's got like she's got a first, middle, last name. Professor Lexi, I believe. Professor Carter is also something I think she's referred to as. It'd be interesting to see if she comes back up again, and if there's an interesting... Because there's an interesting way they could take that story, but at the same time, she sort of fulfilled her purpose to the story, which I think is a little sad to see, because I think there's a slight mystery that's revealed at the end of the second book that I think could have been left for a little while longer if they're going to keep going. You know, like I said, there's another 3 books out in Japan at this point in time, and we're just waiting on the third book coming out over here. I think they could have strung that mystery along a little more, but it seems to be shifting that mystery since it's sort of revealed as like a sort of they are doing something with it that could be equally as interesting, but I also I don't know how that part will go, because something that I'm going to touch upon with Berserk of Gluttony is sort of stringing out character secrets too long. Because now, after a certain mystery reveal, like, both characters are kind of, both Ichika and Harold are keeping a secret from each other. It's sort of a shared secret, in a sense of, like, yeah, it's hard to explain without spoiling it, I'm afraid. But both of them have a secret that they're kind of holding. And I hope that is not strung out too long, because I'm not a big fan of that sort of thing. Usually when that's like a big focus of something, or it's a big kind of character, like a relationship, like plot thread, I usually find myself like internally screaming at both characters, or one character, to just, you know, deal with the problem. Because usually that's what a secret is it's like it's a character avoiding a problem, which, you know, it does, you know, it provides tension, it provides conflict, it provides all these interesting narrative points that series can cover. But at the same time, it can just be a little drawn out when they do this sort of thing. So, you know, hopefully, going by the description of Volume 3, I hope it deals with it there and then. And we have something else going into the books going into the future. But we'll see. I highly recommend your Forma. Like I said, there's only 2 books out right now, so it's not like a big time sink. So yeah, I highly recommend you, if you find yourself intrigued by this absolute train wreck of a discussion I've had with myself about this, yeah, I highly recommend going to read it. It's available through Yen Press. On, you know, if you want to read it digitally, it's available on Apple's bookstore, Bookwalker, I assume, probably Google's book service that I think they still have, or did they shut down Google Play Books? I don't know. Kindle, all those good places for digital, and of course, if you're wanting to buy it physically, I'm sure all good book retailers will have it, like Amazon and Waterstones if you're in the UK and stuff like that. If you're in the US, I'm sorry, I don't really know. Barnes & Noble, Target, I don't know. Though, I hope currently it's not in the issue that Yen Press runs into sometimes, where the first sort of few volumes of some of their series can go out of print for a long time. But yeah, I highly recommend it. So I think with that, I'll close the discussion on your Forma, and I'll start talking about Berserk of Gluttony. So yeah, this is a fantasy series, which, I like fantasy for the most part. I think it can be interesting, I think my concern is always if it lands in doing too much. I think a lot of fantasy stuff can get bogged down in world building, or being overly concerned with certain aspects of what a fantasy story is, that everything else gets lost. Which is certainly the issue I have with The Lord of the Rings. Every time I've tried to read the books, I think the movies are great. Obviously, they're maybe a little long, because I find it hard to go back and rewatch them, because they're so fucking long. But with the books, I've certainly been overwhelmed with the amount of sort of world building, and also scenery description, which, sure, for a fantasy book, there is a sort of extra level of scenery description you need to go into, but there's overdoing it, which I think Lord of the Rings certainly did, for me at least. But jumping over to Berserk of Gluttony, I actually was impressed to a certain degree by this book. Not overly so. I think overall it's very average. Will I keep reading it? I think so. I think since there's only like another 7 books and it's not a heavy read, I think I will just keep going. At least for the time being. I could get through the second or third book and decide to give up with it, but as it stands, I'm interested enough to read more. I'm not overly satisfied with how the first book ends. But anyway, yeah, before I get too into my discussion of the book, I'll read the description again from the bookstore here. Because interestingly, I've owned the first volume of this since it came out in English, which was in 2020, which was 2 years ago. And I'm only just getting around to reading it in the last week or so. And I'm like looking at it, and I start reading it, and I'm not sure what kind of tipped me towards buying it at the time. Not just buying it, I pre-ordered the first one. I'm not sure what pushed me to grab this. Reading the first couple of chapters, I was like, wait, I actually don't know anything about this. And I was like looking at the cover, and the cover's the only familiar thing really about it. And then I read the description on the bookstore, and I'm really not sure what pushed me to pre-order this. Because I'll read it here. Fate Graphite is one of the Forsaken. Cursed with the skill Gluttony, he is ever starving, never sated, until the day he kills a dying thief and devours the man's strength and his soul. The true hunger of Fate's Gluttony has awakened, and if he can learn to control his power, he will at last be the master of his own destiny. Which is just so... So this... I'll tell you what pushed me to check why the fuck I bought this in the first place. It is the third chapter of the book before you learn the main character's name if you haven't read the synopsis. It's all told from first person's perspective. So the first 2 chapters, no one refers to Fate by his name. This includes Roxy, Lady Roxy, who is like the love interest. And we're introduced to her like right away, after some inciting scenes, I guess you could call them, for like Fate's character introduction. But it's the third chapter before Fate's name is dropped, and I'm pretty sure it's in reference to himself. Because Fate spends a lot of his time on his own at the beginning of the book. So we learn in the third chapter his name because he looks at his stats. Because this is a thing in this series. So the basic premise is that you have levels and you have stats and you have abilities. All very fantasy-esque tropes if you're playing a fucking video game. Like Elder Scrolls, which I'm only bringing up because I'm currently looking at my Discord and Shaun is playing Oblivion. So, that makes sense in an isekai. But this is not an isekai. This is just a plain, straight fantasy. Fate is not from another world. Fate did not die and get reincarnated here. Fate didn't get teleported here, like Escaflowne. He's just another person from this world. And the skill he was born with was Gluttony, which was seen to be useless until he was like, I don't know, 18, 20? I don't know how old he is. It's never actually mentioned. And he like kills a bandit. Weirdly, the synopsis refers to the bandit as a thief, but all we know is that these people are trying to break into the castle, and they refer to them constantly as bandits in the text of the book. But yeah, so he kills the bandit, and he hears a voice that mentions that he has like taken the stats and skills from this guy. One of the skills he gets is called Identify, which we're then given a fantastic rundown of how rare a skill that is. But apparently this bandit just has it. Like, it's mentioned as being rare to the point that the people who have this skill can make a lot of money by being the person who reads your stats, lets you know what your skill is, and kind of decides the potential you have for your life. So I don't know why just a random bandit has this skill. It can't be that rare. But the skill is used so much. It is like a foundation of this book. Yeah, it's so bizarre. I'm currently trying to find the passage where it like goes over identify and how rare it is. There it is. Here it is. Okay. If I had so this is from Fate's perspective. This is from the third chapter of the book called Skill Study, where he's kind of going over his own skills and his stats and kind of coming to terms with this change in his life, because all his skills were originally 1. That was their point value, and in the course of the book they get ridiculously high value. And there's like at the beginning I was a little bit frustrated by the lack of context for the skills. Mainly it took a while to give any sort of comparison of Fate skills to like literally anybody else's or any other, you know, like a monster skill or whatever, stats, points and stuff like that. So because, you know, it says he had all 1s, and when he killed the bandit he went up to like 121 vitality, 151 strength, 100 magic, 100 spirit, 131 agility, which means nothing, because that can in some games be really high, or in others it can be pretty low, because in some games you're personally investing points you're given when you level up into your stat value. Let's take Sword Art Online Fatal Bullet for example, because I was playing that recently. When you level up you get certain skill points which you then invest into your various stats like vitality, strength, agility, dexterity, and a couple other ones specific to that game, which go up by 1 point every time you invest a skill point into them. So it means by the time you finish the game, you're looking at like, you're given like a different set of skill points, like a different amount of skill points every time you level up in that game. So the more you level up, the more skill points you're gonna get. So I think like my current build has something like 121 in strength, 135 in vitality, something like that. So you're looking at, you know, fairly, you know, you're looking at triple digit stats for some stuff at the end of the game, but not in everything. And you know, so 100 is a high stat value in that game. But in others, if it's, you know, you're investing your skill points into other things, or in some cases, in some games, you're leveling up and your stats just naturally go up, or they're you know, they're dictated by other things like armor might give you certain stats, like you know, there's some games that your attack, your health, your defense and all this sort of stuff are tied to stats that are tied to armor or equipment or various other things. So there is, and that can mean that you end up with like ridiculously high stats. Like just thinking about Raid Shadow Legends off the top of my head, because for some reason I was playing that again recently. You can have some ridiculous stats like 9,000, or, you know, like a damage output of 9,000. So, you know, we're just given this, and then it's a while before we get any context for what Fate's scores actually mean. But yeah, back to my point of identify, it's here, like, in the first page of this chapter on my iPad. I read on my iPad, so page count and stuff like that is a bit all over the place. If you're reading like the physical book or something, it's probably different. There'll be like more pages. Fate says this: if I had identify, I could quit gatekeeping and become an appraiser. They made good money because their skills were highly specialized. But why did this random bandit have it then? Because the act of stealing skills when you kill someone is like exclusive, at least as far as we're aware right now, to Fate, because his gluttony skill means that he takes someone's like entire soul when they die. He kind of like consumes it, so he gains their stats and their skills. Obviously, if they have a skill he already has, he just gains the stats, because there's skills don't stack. They have higher level ones, like strength boost has a low, medium, and high, and you can stack those, but you can't stack multiple low strength strength boost low, stats. So I think by the end of the first book he has like strength boost low, medium, and high, so you can stack them. But yeah, it becomes like a core thing of this book where he'll just check like everything's stats, which makes sense. You know, he's sort of level 1 and just learning how to use, well, he's never fought anything before, and so he has to get used to like fighting, and he has to you know, learn to fight, and he doesn't want to go up against something that's stronger than him, because obviously he doesn't want to fucking die because he's their main character. But yeah, I think it's a weird thing for the book, because it sort of takes you away from the straight fantasy element of it, which otherwise can be like really interesting at times, because we're only ever seeing the book from Fate's perspective. It's always told in the first person. And so it does like a really nice amount of natural world building through Fate's situation. We're introduced to the kingdom of Sephor, which I think I'm pronouncing correctly, which this is an interesting thing. Neither of these have anime adaptations yet. So I currently don't know how any of these names are actually meant to be pronounced. For some things, like Ichika's name, I'm just guessing. Because I haven't heard them spoken out loud yet. But yeah, so we're introduced to the kingdom of Sephor at first in its sort of slums, because that's where Fate lives. Then when Roxy sort of takes him under her wing, although she doesn't know about his gluttony and everything yet, which is one of my main issues, sort of that may become a point of frustration for me with the series, is that he never tells Roxy, at least not within the first book, about gluttony, about his escapades as an adventurer and stuff. He sort of leads a double life a little bit. It seems unnecessary to me. There's like no fucking reason really within the plot as to why he really needs to hide his identity. Like he's scared that Roxy will reject him because of gluttony, but yeah, bruh, Roxy is really into him, like really fucking into him, and sure, he is dense protagonist, so he doesn't get it. But yeah, no, anyway. What was I saying? Natural world building. So once Roxy takes him under her care, we're sort of introduced to the Holy Knights district, which is where all of the people who become Holy Knights live, and we're introduced to a little bit more of the sort of more higher class. But we don't really see much outside of Roxy's mansion. There is one part of the book where they go back to Roxy's home village, villa, I guess, where like her mother still lives, and like they own a vineyard and stuff like that. So but again, it spends more time focused on Fate's, you know, like taking down monsters and satisfying his gluttony. So we do get some like natural world building throughout the first book, and I thought, oh, this is cool. You know, if we're going into the second book, it could be, you know, more interesting. We get to know a little bit more of Sephor and stuff like that. And then no, just to sort of lightly spoil the end of the first book, Fate and Roxy both leave Sephor for another country, which is mentioned a lot throughout the first book, sure, but I feel like that's a twist to come a little later. I feel like they could have done another 2 books just in Sephor, and like I get sort of why. The author sort of wrote themselves into a corner because nothing around is like, by the end of the first book, satisfying Fate's gluttony. So I guess heading to this other country means that there'll be, stronger enemies that do satisfy his gluttony. But yeah, I don't know. It feels like a weird ending. I feel like there could have been more done because, like I said, Fate sort of tries to lead a double life, and the end of the first book sort of just conveniently drops it a little bit. Whereas I felt like that could have been a more interesting dynamic overall. And now it's just going to be a case of both of these people are vaguely in the same location. And I guess Fate's going to have to try and hide the fact that he's there from Roxy, because he clearly, he doesn't want her to know that he has strength. But he's annoyed when she leaves the kingdom and doesn't ask him for help. But she doesn't know that he's strong. She's under the impression that he is weak. And I know I said I wasn't going to spoil anything, but I don't think I actually recommend this book. I don't know. I think it is slightly interesting. It's an easy read. It's not too heavy. But there are frustrating points, and I hope they pan out. Even if this series is very sort of generic fantasy, and I think it could have been done much better. And there could have been more interesting character plot threads, but you can only do so much. Well, I don't know why I said you can only do so much. I'm not in control of how this is written. I just wanted to thing to say to end my thought. One thing I did have a weird moment with is so a very common thing in light novels is to have a side story in it at the end. Sometimes you get one at the end. Some series have one volume will have a collection of short stories in it. The second volume, the second, 6th, and 8th volume? No, the second, 7th, and 8th volume, if I recall correctly, of Sword Art Online are all short story collections. Interestingly, those are all integral in filling out character stories for characters that show up constantly throughout the series after that. And if you've watched the anime, all of those, most of those side stories, get adapted in season 1. So if you've watched the first season of Sword Art Online, the Christmas episode, the episode where Kirito meets Silica and has to revive Pina, the one where he goes up the mountain with Lisbeth, and another one. Oh, the ones involving Yui, I think. Those are all side stories. I'm sure the Yui ones are side stories, because I remember reading the first volume and going, when's Yui gonna show up? And then I'm pretty sure she's in one of the side story books. So yeah. It ends with a side story. Sorry, I keep distracting myself and derailing my own fucking point. And I said it was going to be a shorter episode, and I'm already looking at the runtime thinking, wrap it the fuck up soon. So I'm going to be quick about my last couple of points. The final side story takes place from Roxy's perspective, which is fine, but we instantly end with the last chapter of the book all being from Fate's perspective, which is all in first person perspective, and then suddenly just starting with Roxy referring to herself in first person. And it's a little bit, it took me a little bit of, I reread the first couple of sentences a few times just to sort of settle in to it being from Roxy's perspective. So I think even if it made no sense for Fate to be relating the story to the reader, I think it would have just made for a slightly easier reading experience than, you know, I mean, it doesn't even need to be Fate relating it to us. It could have just been the omniscient narrator. Like, I would have been fine with that, but the first person perspective of the side story at the end did knock me a little bit for a loop. Just because we've been with Fate entirely throughout the first book, and I don't see that changing. I think it's very much like Sword Art Online, where it's all from the main character's perspective. Like Sword Art Online is almost entirely from Kirito's perspective, except in some side stories, and except in the I guess it's a side story, but it's actually very much canon. The story involving Yuki and Asuna, which is all from Asuna's perspective, which lends a lot of fucking weight to that story when you read it in the book. And so I think the anime did a little bit of a disservice to that story when it adapted it in the end of season 2. But still, yeah. So Berserk of Gluttony, I'm interested right now to see how it goes. And there only being 8 books, which I guess for some people, seems like that's the entirety of the Harry Potter series. But light novels are shorter, and they're usually a lighter reading experience. They're much easier to read through. There's nothing too challenging about reading them. So considering I've read Sword Art Online, and I'm keeping up with quite a few other light novel series at this point, it's a very kind of, it's not a low bar, but it's not a particularly high bar. Like, I have all of the Vampire Hunter D's books on my iPad now to read through, because I got them in the Humble Bundle recently, and that's daunting because there's 29 of them to read through. But yeah, I'm interested to see where it goes. I don't rate it particularly high. Like, if I'm currently to give both of these series a rating, even though I think both are very much too early to tell, I'd give your Forma a solid 8 out of 10. I think potentially, depending on the direction it goes, and if it doesn't overstay its welcome, I think it could be a 9, maybe 10. I don't think it's a 10, actually. I do have some issues with it. Particularly the second book, it feels a little forced in some of its mystery, and some of it, how some of it kind of comes to a resolution. It feels a little convoluted in the last chapter. I'd say it could be a solid 9 out of 10. Berserk of Gluttony right now, I'd 5 or 6 out of 10. Somewhere in that range. It's very average. It's fine. It's inoffensive. Most of the characters are very tropey. Fate is very much the archetype overpowered protagonist. I'd say he does beat out some of these types of characters, because I feel like he does have a personality. He does have a story that we're following that isn't just get more powerful. Like, that's half his story. But I feel like he has at least somewhat of an interesting character arc in the first book that, again, I think is fucked up a little bit by the ending. And I think, Roxy is an interesting character because I feel like it flips the script of the normal, how to put it, what's the sort of damsel in distress. It's normally in these power fantasy things, it's like the main character is super strong, and the love interest is someone who he kind of takes under his wing because they're downtrodden or whatever or however you want to put it. Whereas Roxy's very much a strong character. She's the head of a very important family in the Kingdom of Sephor, and she has she has very much her own thing going on. And so I think a lot of what I find interesting in the book is both, fate. I don't know how to put it into words, actually. I find Roxy the most intriguing character so far, but then I feel like some of it is a little undone by having that last chapter all from her perspective. I think it gives away a little bit too much that we as the reader right now shouldn't be privy to. And it looks like I just bought the second book before I started recording this, and I had a little look at the chapter list of the contents page. And there's another side story from Roxy's perspective. So I really hope that this isn't a constant thing with the books where we get all of the book being from Fate's perspective, and then we see a side story at the end from Roxy's perspective that usually kind of recaps some major events from her perspective. That I think just gives away too much information that we as the viewer shouldn't currently need to know. I think that there's a more engaging and interesting way to do that and have it come up more naturally through the actual plot, through the actual storyline. I think that doing it like this right now undermines some of what it's trying to set up. So yeah, it's decent. Wouldn't necessarily recommend it. If you like fantasy stuff, it's all right. But be aware it's very tropey, very power fantasy, very kind of very generic, and most senses of if you've experienced fantasy anime before. A lot of fantasy anime can fall into this, and it really does feel like the isekai what is the word I'm looking for? Why are words failing me? Every time I record an episode of my own, words just absolutely fail me. It's the isekai like framework, but without the isekai part. It's so strange. Like, I really feel like Fate should be someone who died and got reincarnated into this world, but he's not. And it does actually make it slightly more interesting because he is like a part of this world. He's not someone who's a fish out of water. And I think that does make the story a little bit more engaging. We're not having to just learn everything at the beginning of the book because the characters having to learn everything at the beginning of the book because they've just got into this world, which a lot of isekai tend to do. It does a lot of its world building naturally, like I said, which is one of the very kind of interesting parts of it. But yeah, overall decent. I don't think it's gonna wow me and be one of my favorites as I go along, but it's I'd say it's all right. That's all I can come up with, is that it is all right. So yeah, if you want to read something interesting, something engaging, and something half philosophical, it's not quite committed to it yet, then go read your Forma. If you are wanting some fantasy schlock to just get by with because it's an easy read, Berserk of Gluttony. There's one that I highly recommend here, and the other is Berserk of Gluttony. So yeah, thank you for listening to this episode. I'm sorry it's been such a train wreck. I feel like I say this every time I record one on my own. Yeah, if you're wondering where the seasonal update is, I decided not to do an impressions episode this time because it would be very close to the wrap up episode, the review episode, I guess you could call it. So what I'm gonna do, I'm not gonna do the impressions episode this season. I may just forego them through all seasons. I think just usually because it means recording and releasing them ends up making them very close to when the next one talking about the season's gonna come out, and it feels like it just defeats the purpose of the impressions episode because you're only hearing it maybe a month after. So yeah, I think the December first episode in December may be the season wrap up. If it's not, it'll be the first one in January for sure, I think. But I just don't think doing a impressions episode makes any sense at this point in time. I'm not sure what it is. Something about it. I had planned to do it, and then I thought it doesn't feel important to do one of them, and I'd rather just do a wrap up of the season. So I'll yeah, it does mean I'm creating more work for myself because I need to try and figure out another episode to come in between this and the season wrap up probably. But yeah, anyway, thanks for listening. You can go follow us on Twitter over at Anime Lanecast to keep up to date with what we are talking about in new episodes. Like, if you follow us on Twitter, you would have seen the week before this episode released that we were going to be talking about your Forma and Berserk of Gluttony as a sort of spoiler warning, even though I didn't really want to spoil the books, but I guess it gave you a chance to sort of go, oh, maybe this will be interesting or whatever. So yeah, tune in next time where I assume we're talking about Akira, like I mentioned at the beginning of the episode, because I don't think that one's out yet. Yeah, goodbye.